this case, provided that your entities and the income generated from the properties are actually positive cash flow, and there's a surplus in those entities, the banks will not factor in the liability attached to those entities when you go and borrow for a new entity.
Welcome to Get Invested on the Property Hub podcast channel, the leading weekly show to help you unlock your full self-health and wealth potential. I'm your host, Bushy Martin, and each week I go deep with the best investors, experts, leaders and founders to find out what it takes to break free from the grind, discover freedom and live by design. Subscribe now and join me and get invested in the life you really want. Let's get started. Hi, freedom fighters. Is your dream of property ownership fading? Are you suffering major challenges trying to get a loan for your next property? Is your income considered insufficient to secure the loan you need because your borrowing capacity has dropped following all of the recent rate rises? Well, if this is you, or perhaps it's someone that you know who's struggling with all of this, then you've landed in the right place at the right time. Because in this episode of your Property Hub's Get Invested, we continue our special grassroots series talking to hands-on investors who share their trials and tribulations and how they've managed to overcome the considerable hurdles that they faced in order to continue to invest in property. Which brings us to this week's special guest, Monica Revels, who's reportedly uncovered a bank hack that has enabled her to overcome her income loan servicing constraints to secure 3 properties that now cost her nothing to own. And how has she achieved all this? Well, stay tuned, because this is just part of what we're going to enjoy unpacking for you today. But before we get into this great conversation, if you or someone you know wants to share your unique property journey for the benefits of others here on Get Invested, just reach out to me personally at bushy@knowhowproperty.com.au. Now, for those of you who've been listening to me for quite some time, as a closet amateur musician myself, you'll know that I often talk about the essence of sustainable success revolving around composing and writing your own life symphony and then becoming the orchestra leader in order to coordinate the performance of the right musicians playing the right instruments in the right way at the right time in order to transform your dreams into reality. And nowhere is this more evident than the example of today's special guest. Monica's a multi-talented 30-something youth polymath whose love of music and the violin has driven her creative and innovative professional and academic career across the broad spectrum of her roles as an entrepreneur, a multidisciplinary academic, a researcher and an educator. And in this regard, her talents and interests have been spread across the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, a law degree, her work as a solicitor and her own tech startup. And somewhere amongst all of this, she still finds time to invest in property. So I'm really looking forward to diving into your journey, Monica, and welcome, and let's get invested.
Thanks, Bushy.
Look, I've read a number of stories about you in recent times, which really captured my interest, Monica. So for those that are listening in and who don't know who you are, can you sort of start off by giving us a bit of rundown on what you do differently and, as importantly, why you do what you do, Monica?
Yeah, I mean, like everyone, I think when you first started working, you sort of go after working in a full-time role. And fairly early on in my career, I was, some might say, unfortunate, or in my case, fortunate enough to be made redundant in a role that I was working in full-time. And that really changed my perspective on employability. And it was something at that particular age I kind of wanted and realized that I don't want to work harder. I want to work smarter. And for me, having quite a lot of skill sets in a lot of disciplines, I wouldn't say I'm a specialist in anything. I realized that, you know, I could have the best of some of my skills in doing everything that I love to do and just finding a way to generate the most money out of those particular activities into basically a sustainable project management type of work. And so that's what I do. So I'm an academic. I teach students across 3 universities here in Sydney in the areas of business and law. I also do a brief subject also on music, business and professional practice, which is always a fun one for me because it's really great to see students actually take what I teach them and actually do something practical with it, which is always amazes us every year. And with that said, I do a bit of legal work as well to keep up with my law skills and qualifications. And I still teach music, which is something that I'm very passionate about. And often a lot of people say to me, how can you do all of that? And I'm like, well, I work for myself. So I get to pick and choose when I work, what I do. And how each day is always very different for me. So, and I love that. I don't think I can go back to being in a very routine sort of stuck 9-to-5 role. Yeah.
Love it. Everything you've just spoken about sort of pretty much mirrors my own approach to life, Monica, and it's a rare one, and not many people have the level of self-confidence to do that and to take that on. Where is your sort of self-belief and self-confidence in that regard come from to take a portfolio approach to life, if that's a good enough description?
Look, it's hard to say, but I mean, I think it's that initial first step doing it. So I remember when I first went from losing a full-time job, essentially because of change management and reduction of costs in the business, and going, oh crap, what am I going to do now? And I was briefly, no joke, I was briefly on Centrelink in that transition period. Regretted because I ended up with some robo debt, which is still, there in the background for whatever reason. And but it was really, really funny because at that particular point in time, I was having a look at the people that I knew and friends that were working in 9-to-5 jobs. And like me, I would be working 9-to-5, but actually be working longer, realistically, in those roles, doing overtime and other things that crept up. And whilst in my full-time role, I really loved it, my friends in their full-time roles absolutely hated it. They hated waking up in the morning. They hated going to work. They hated staying back. They were always whinging about it. And I remember doing the maths at one point. I think at the time in my first job, I was earning about $70,000 as my base income. And I was like, you know what, I'm working 50-hour weeks. Let's calculate this on an hourly basis. And then I had a sudden realization that if I actually worked at Woolies on a Sunday and Saturday, or Saturday and Sunday, I'd actually probably earn pretty much the same amount of money. And I didn't have to take home the stresses that came with work, particularly dealing with certain work personalities, etc. And it was something that you just kind of do your work and go. I was like, okay, well, I don't really want to work for Woolies either, but, if that's the monetary equivalent, there's got to be a better way. And I started calculating, at this point I was living at home with my parents who were renting, was supporting them with their rent. And I was like, there has to be a better way to earn like an hourly figure that was going to give me that freedom. Yep. So I started to work on that. And I realized that even though at the time when I was working full time, I didn't do really much violin teaching, I was only doing maybe 4 hours a week. I was like, you know what, even if I work at a school 1 day a week and then did maybe 10, 15 hours at home during the rest of my week, I'd still actually make more money than what I was doing in my full-time job, because my hourly rate would be a lot more dearer. And then I had the flexibility to pick and choose as well when I could work. And so that started, and then an opportunity came up actually at Macquarie University to start teaching there. They were very interested in the fact that not only had I at this point done an MBA, I had my own music teaching studio where I was hiring a number of teachers throughout Sydney.
Yep.
And they were like, we're going to hire you because you actually have a creative degree, not a traditional business background. And later on as well, I did some work for PwC, and they also said the same thing to me as well. We're hiring you because you have a degree in music and you're creative, not because you have a traditional accounting degree, which always struck me as strange. But as I've realized across my career, actually, that creativity is something that makes me very unique and more employable, because I don't view the world in a very set formula that we get taught. I kind of look to see, here's a problem, and whilst I might not be able to solve this problem just yet, I'm going to think about the different ways and different approaches in solving that problem. And that's something that I do now across all aspects of my life, my career, my personal life, and even in my property journey as well.
Love it, love it. It's what I'm hearing there, and we spoke briefly before we hit the record button today about the importance of creativity, particularly in the world moving ahead, given what AI is going to do for all the sort of standard procedural type activity. But what I love about what you're saying there is that there's no such thing as a problem to you. It's just an issue to be overcome. And that's a very different mindset to a lot of people who hit a problem and then it's a no, and that's the end of the story. So we'll circle back around that a little bit later when we talk about the property exercise, because it's particularly relevant given some of the great work you've done in that area. But while we're talking about music, Monica, I'd love for you to talk about where your sort of initial love of music came from, and how do you feel that music has benefited you in other areas of your life in addition to what we've already spoken about?
Yeah, I mean, funny story. I was forced to play a musical instrument growing up because the school I was at, it was compulsory to pick up an instrument from year one. And yeah, so, and at the time I actually wanted to play the flute. And one of the music teachers at the time, who is now the associate dean of, the deputy dean of the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, and a fantastic Australian composer, Matthew Heinsohn, was like, you need to play the violin. And I was like, no, I wanted to play the flute. So somehow he convinced me and gave me a lot of repertoire, particularly in the younger generations, that was fun and more jazzy, because I really liked that sort of pop jazz influence. I wasn't a big fan of classical.
Yep.
And then from there, it was something like, actually, you know what, I enjoy, playing this instrument. And I think as well, because from the school side of things, it was something that was compulsory. So everyone had to do it. So you're not going to, it's not like some of the other experiences that some of my students have where, oh, I'm the only person that plays in the band and my friends make fun of me. It's nothing like that, because everyone is doing it, and you're forced into developing a bit of a habit and routine, which is you're playing the instrument anyways. The school's giving you the instrument to play on. The school's giving you lessons. So you may as well just, like your homework, do a bit each day. And that from that routine, then it became a passion, particularly when I got to high school and more opportunities opened up with, different orchestras, playing in bands. I joined the Senior Youth Orchestra as well, and that was really exciting because you got to travel and socialize with, a lot of other individuals that had very similar passions. And, you do interesting events as well. Like we played one year at Duntroon out in Canberra for their September graduation ceremony, and you get to like play with fireworks and cannons, and it's all like, fun and exciting, and you're meeting interesting people along the way. So
it's brilliant. Talk to me about, because as I mentioned to you before we started the conversation, I'm a bit of a closet muso myself, and I've taken up piano very late in life. I've done other things, but I've always loved the piano. So I think it was about 5 years ago I started. And a lot of people say, well, how do you manage to play like that, given you haven't worked so long? And I always say, well, it's just the amount of time I spend every day on the piano. It's a practice thing. It's no inherent talent that I've got. I just work hard at it. I just put in time every day, and I'm not even scratching the surface of what you've achieved in your career already in relation to the music exercise. Can you share what sort of time you spend practicing and how important that regular discipline is? Because I think there's overlays between that, again, and success in property investment, because if you just keep you patient and persistent about doing things, you'll achieve the results. Can you share a little bit of that for us?
Yeah, so it depended on, I guess, the age and what level I was at throughout my music learning. So like, when you first start to learn an instrument, you just do the bare minimum. Usually it's about 10 minutes a day sort of thing, and it's more to develop the habits. When I went to high school, there'll be days where I couldn't practice because there was so much going on. I mean, I was also competing in rhythmic gymnastics at a national level at that point as well. So I had a lot of training and sport commitments in addition to the music commitments that I was doing. And then basically I had to make a decision it was around year 10, year 11, where I had to stop the sport and focus on the music, because I wanted to get into the Conservatorium of Music. And that's when my practice changed, and it would fluctuate. So, for instance, if I had an assessment or an audition or a competition or a recital, the weeks leading up to it, I would be probably doing around anywhere between 2 to 4 hours of practice a day.
Yep.
And mind you, because I'm a violinist, you can physically, play your instrument for 4 hours a day. There's a lot of people out there who play trumpets and saxophones where they can't do that much practice because it wrecks your lips and whatnot. But for a violinist, you just play away for 4 hours a day, or up to 4 hours a day, and it taught me a lot in terms of how to manage my time.
Yes.
So particularly in those upper high school years, I was doing, I think, 12 units of study. I was doing some very heavy subjects like 4-unit English, 3-unit maths as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, I basically had to become very good at setting my time and making the best use of my time. So on the days where I couldn't practice 4 hours a day because there just wasn't enough hours in the day with school, co-curricular, study, exam prep, etc., I aimed to get at least an hour done.
Yep.
And that would be my goal. And I learned how to become very efficient at my practice, like focusing on just the things that needed to be worked on rather than playing the things that felt comfortable and easy. And you learn to, target the things that you're not comfortable about and tackle them first.
Yes.
And there's a sense of accomplishment when you do kind of go after a few attempts, like, okay, it's getting better. It's getting better. A week later, it's like, actually, yeah, it's getting great. And your teacher's like giving you that feedback as well, that you then go, it's worth the effort. And there's that sense of achievement. And that then motivates you to take that approach into other things. So during that period, I must admit, I probably hardly knew what procrastination was. But at the same time,
wouldn't have had time to procrastinate, I would say.
Well, yeah, because just my approach, and it's kind of why I like to be busy even in my career, because as soon as I am in a job where there's not much going on, I just hate that procrastination feeling of, and I feel like it takes more time out of my day. But even that, like, I became very good at, tackling hard things first and confronting some of those challenges head first. And I think that's kind of where my confidence comes in, to be able to do what I do and take that step. And as you said, where do you get your confidence in having that project management role? Well, it came down to, seeing people hate their lives in a 9-to-5 job. I had mates who were traveling the world as musicians, picking and choosing their work. They had a fantastic lifestyle. And then I also had the support of my parents, who themselves were entrepreneurial. They didn't have a 9-to-5 job. They ran businesses all their lives and things like that. And whilst they had a lot of negative experiences, which I learned from and keep in the back of my mind even now to this day, I sort of realized that, you don't really want to be constrained to that 9-to-5. And as I got older, particularly as I approached 30 and I was starting to think about settling down, having a family, as someone who has to be intellectually, have that intellectual stimulation a lot of the time, when I have kids, I want to be able to have that flexibility where I can do some work whilst a child is resting or having their playtime, and then also be able to be there for them, to give them that, attention 100% of, and give my fullest attention to them. So having that balance and that ability to kind of, work, switch off, or, take a couple months off and travel and just, enjoy life, that became really, really important to me.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. Now, you're clearly an overachiever, and it stands out. You've only got to spend 5 minutes on Google to work that out. Where did your drive to overachieve in pretty much every aspect of your life come from? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, look, that came from a very early age. So, and a lot of it comes from probably my parents, but also the school environment I was in. So, yeah. I was fortunate at the time to go to a good school. That particular school at the time was heavily invested in what they call independent learning and self-regulated learning habits. And what I didn't know as a child, but now I know as an adult and actually doing research in this area to this day, was that a lot of the stuff that we learned in primary school about collaboration and this entrepreneurial mindset was somewhat encouraged and supported by the staff of the school. So for instance, like from year 3 onwards, we would have to do some sort of creative project where we could do whatever we wanted, present it however we like, but it had to be on, like a particular topic or an idea matched with an emotion or something like that. And you just turn it into a project and you'd spend like two terms working on it and then, present to the class. So it's little things like that.
What a great environment. Your parents were obviously, it showed a fair bit of foresight to recognise that educational environment was going to be good for you.
To be honest, I'm not sure if they did that. I think part of their choice in choosing a school was that, first of all, it was kind of close to where they worked. And number 2, they didn't want me at the time going to a public school because back in the day, we were living in Greenacre, and the local public school was pretty rough. And my parents were like, because, I'm a first generation Australian, they were like, we don't want you to go through the things we went through when we were growing up. So we're just going to invest a little bit more in your education. With that said, though, it was also during a period where my parents had lost their business. They had lost their house, partly because of the effects of the 1990 recession, but also because some bad advice. My dad's best friend, who was a solicitor, was actually in fact forging my parents' signatures on loan documents and doing all this sort of stuff. He got disbarred at the end of the day, believe it or not. But at the same time, once that has happened, there's no recourse. They had to sell up everything. They lost everything, their superannuation, and basically had to start from scratch.
Now, that would have been, you probably would have been almost absorbing that by osmosis at the time. How has that affected your relationship with money? I mean, you mentioned earlier that, you've sized up the salary versus working in Woolies and worked out that you're probably better off doing part-time stuff and still be pulling in the same coin. Talk to us about your relationship with money from those early days and how that's sort of transcribed into how you've approached the whole investment arena.
Yeah, look, my parents did their best to try and shield me as much as possible from that. But even as a child, you will hear conversations when you go to bed of, mum and dad talking or arguing over money, as would be the case. And there were days, for instance, where my parents would practically eat just, a toast in the evening because they just could not afford, to serve dinner and things like that. And they would rather feed, the kids rather than actually eat themselves and things like that. So from that, I must admit, I became pretty savvy with budgeting and tightening down when it came to it. I'm probably less like that now, but especially in my early 20s and mid 20s, I would, calculate everything. I'd have a budget for, okay, this is how much I'm spending on a night out. And I look for ways, if we were to go out with mates, how can we still go out but not spend ridiculous amounts of money? Is there a gig at the local pub which we can see for free, and we might eat at home or eat at Macca's and then just spend a bit on drinks and just have a nice night. So you don't have to sacrifice, but you just look at it in a different way. And that definitely has affected my relationship with money, because for me, I used to have like a figure which was, I'll earn 100K. And once I hit that, it was like, oh, what's my next goal? Okay. Make it 250, And so you and once you hit those targets, you're like, well, what else is there to it? And so for me, it became a game. It became like a game of how much can I earn in a week, and if I can, make, 5-10K in a week, that's, a tick. Okay. Next thing, let's try and get some more, and it became like a game of, how can I find ways to generate income, but also how can I find ways to save income? And then you have other issues as well, like, HECS debts and all that other scary stuff, which is about to also go up very soon. So not looking forward to that.
Absolutely right. No, you're dead right there. Before I sort of start transitioning into your investment journey, if you look back on your life to date, Monica, what challenging event has brought about your greatest learnings and biggest changes, do you think?
I think seeing my parents lose everything, that was tough. And then also having to, you're in an environment in a school where everyone has everything the parents want, and you can't go to parties, you can't buy the latest outfits, you're shopping at, Big W for clothes when everyone else is, going to Target or something, so those sort of things. So that had a big impact, as well as that. And then as I got older, having to then support my parents financially as well, particularly when they went through some health problems. So both my parents went through that. There was a period of time when I think I was in second or third year of uni where, because my parents were renting, it was a rental crisis, not very different to what we're having now, where you'd go to an open home, there'd be 40 people just at that house. So there was a brief period where for a couple of months we were living in a motel, in the inner suburbs, and had all the furniture and everything in storage because we could not get a house that was that many applicants, and it was basically best in, best dressed. And it wasn't until we realized that, and we saw another family do this, was at a open home. This family went up to the agent and said, look, we're going to offer you $50 more per week. Can you give us a lease? And we signed for the keys today. And the agent said yes. And when we saw that, we were like, okay, let's do that on the next house. If we really, really like it, let's just offer more money. And so we did that.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people out there will be like, why should you do that? And it's like, well, clearly if there's 40 people showing up for a rental property, clearly that rental price is too much in demand. And so to make your, application more attractive, you're going to have to pay more. And that's just the reality of life. And so in my mind, I was like, okay, $50 more a week, that for me is another 2 students at the time, and so that's what I did. I, worked, got another 2 students to be able to support my parents through that journey. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. So looking at that, how's that experience influenced your ongoing approach to life?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think for me, I approach most things I do in life from a more pragmatic point of view. So my relationship now with having money, it's not because I want it.
Yeah.
And not so much either because I need it. It's more of, okay, well, I'm willing to pay to just get the job done.
Yeah.
For practicality point of view. And of course, within reason, you don't, obviously you want to overpay for something, but you got to take the emotion out of money. I think a lot of people are very emotionally attached to the wallet. And that's when people get into trouble either with credit card debt or just, being like, I can't afford this. And they get that tunnel vision and they can't get out of it. Whereas you kind of go, you know what? Okay, let's have a bit of a reality check. Yeah, I need a roof over my head. And whilst it's going to cost me maybe $50 a week more than what I'm paying, what can I do to increase my income by $50 or more a week so I can afford that? And that's always been my attitude. It has always been, what can I do to be able to afford the things I want? So if I wanted a car, if I wanted to buy some nice clothes or something like that, if I had a goal, it would be like, what can I do to afford that?
Love it. Again, that's that solutions approach rather than the problem approach. Yeah. I'd love to transition now into your property journey. And I just want to start off with, why did you decide to invest and what triggered your interest in property as the thing to invest in?
So probably, funny story, a bad relationship, number one. I was dating someone at the time whose family had invested in quite a few properties actually in the Enmore, Stanmore area in Sydney. Yep. And they bought like really massive properties with 4 or 5 bedrooms, but they would basically turn them into share houses. Right. And my partner at the time, my boyfriend at the time, he every weekend was going over to basically manage those share houses, collect the cash from the international students who are living in those houses. And, there was some times I said to him, is the headache really worth it? Because you'd have issues of people not paying, people leaving suddenly, never to be seen again sort of thing. But what I realized quite quickly was, well, if you rent out 5 rooms for about $200, $250 a week, and your mortgage at the time is, say, I can't even remember back then, but it was about two grand a month. You have this surplus, which you can then use as a deposit, plus the equity in the property, etc.
Yeah.
So that kind of stirred my brain of, oh, actually, you know what, I could earn money without actually having to do anything, effectively. So at the end of that relationship, when that sort of ended, I think for me, I was a bit sort of down about how things ended there. And one of the things for me was, you know what, I went out and bought myself a property.
Yeah. Did you have were there any initial fears or concerns before you bought that first property?
A little bit was, first of all, do I have enough deposit and stamp duty and all of that? The other issue as well was because I was not considered a full-time employee by the banks. I had to get my brother involved in that one. So just to be able to service the loan calculations, to be able to afford it, even though the property would be paying itself off, even though I could afford it, even though I had the deposit, my brother didn't. It was, anyways, that's a whole other issue there in terms of banks and how they calculate serviceability and prefer those who are a slave to the 9 to 5. But that was my biggest concern. I guess my biggest concern was actually parting with, at this point, what had been my savings, because pretty much when I bought my first property, which I think was 2016, end of 2016, this was about 6 years after my first job, 4 years after I lost my first full-time job. And so 6 years before that point, so 2010, I had $0 in my bank account, you know, and I had saved, I had worked really hard, and suddenly I had, $60,000, $70,000 sitting in a bank account that I was going to use towards a deposit. I'm like, oh crap, once I use this money on a deposit, I'm back to zero again, and it was a very scary thought, because for me, having, $60,000 sitting in an account was a lot of money to physically have as cash in the bank, and was something that I'd never had before. So, having that mindset of it's okay to let it go and go back to zero, and I might have to use my credit card for a few months to pay off a few things if needed, but, it will build up again. And so, and even to this day, every time I buy a property and my savings or even my offset account goes down to zero, I'm freaking out again, going, I need to put more money back into it. And then I go, okay, well, here we go again. Let's find a way to, make sure we can afford everything we need to afford.
Yeah, spot on. Well, I'd love to unpack your ongoing property journey now, and one of the important points there I think you've raised is that when you hit the hurdle in relation to not being able to borrow under your own right, I'm assuming jointly bought that property. Your brother was both on the title and on the loan. Was that
That's
how it
right? So it was joint tenants. With a 50-50 split. With that said, though, I was a bit annoyed a few years later, because I didn't realize we could actually have done it as two mortgages rather than a single mortgage. And if we had done it as the two mortgages, we probably still would have had the property together today. But this is food for thought. Anyone who wants to, buy property with someone else, like a sibling or a business partner, etc., is that when you take out that loan and both your names are on the loan, you're not responsible for 50% of the loan. You're responsible for 100% of the loan. And that gets taken into account in your serviceability.
Totally. And there are a few banks that allow you to have, as you said, separate loans and then only focus on the equity component that you're responsible for, but they are fewer than the many. So you certainly need to do some hunting on that. Were there any issues? Because I've often talked to people in the past about be very careful when you go into a property with someone else, because unless you're married to them, life dynamics tend to change and needs tend to change. Did that create any challenges for you? And what was the way of exiting that exercise?
Yeah, look, the main challenge, I guess, came down to, for instance, when we had periods where a tenant wasn't in the property and we had to add a little bit onto the loan ourselves. So, for instance, my brother, who has a 9 to 5 job, he can't save as much as I can. And in actual fact, he can often borrow more money than I can. There was a point where he could borrow more money than I could. But he could only save 10 grand in a year. Whereas me, on the other hand, I could save twice as much, 3 times as much if I wanted to. So it was quite ironic in that situation. So he often, he had his own expenses, his own family and stuff like that, where he had to, of course, provide for them. So there would often be a bit of a struggle where I ended up being the bank, the family, the little sister bank, and
having of the big sister.
Yeah, and having to lend him the money, and I'd get paid at tax time when he gets a refund from his tax return, sort of thing. Which would often be frustrating because sometimes, especially in the beginning with the deposit, and we did some repairs and renovations to the property. There was a point where he had owed me about close to $10,000, and it took him about 3-4 years to pay that back to me. So, and of course without interest. So, yeah, you have to kind of have those discussions early on when you go into the property about, okay, what happens if you can't afford it? How does this work? How do we repay it back? So we had all of that in place. So we were pretty good on that. But there was also times where I'd be getting frustrated saying I could really do with, the money you owe me. And, it made those conversations a little bit challenging, because being family, you kind of don't want to say, hey, by the way, where's this money? Because it puts stress on that relationship. Yeah.
Totally agree. So did you still own the property with your brother, or has that changed? And I'd love you to sort of take us through from there, that first property, where that led to for you personally.
Yeah. So we don't have that property together. We did a bit of a restructure and whatnot. So what happened was that I then, a few years later, I think it was just in the start of COVID, I decided to buy a property on my own, quite a cheap property, but with a good rental return and quite good growth. So I bought that property, and at this point, after that property, the banks were like, we can't lend you anymore. You've hit your maximum serviceability. And I was like, I called BS on that, to be honest. Because I'm looking at my tax returns. I'm making over 100K after tax a year. Both my properties are positively geared by far. And this was not with the 2%, 1% interest rates we had. This was with the interest rates at about 5%. So kind of a little bit less than where we are now, but almost the same. And they were both positively geared, and the banks were like, no. And then I was looking into it because one thing that fascinated me when I first started my property journey with the ex-partner that I have was that his family also were buying property in so-called company structures, which always made me go, why? So I started asking why. And then from my law background and experience, I was aware that, you could buy property in companies and it would be treated a lot differently. So it got me thinking, saying, okay, well, what if I were to sell some of these properties into a company? And then I was like, oh no, I'm not going to get the capital gains tax. Okay, so let's, figure out ways to do it. So I started chatting to people, and I didn't even realize that in a book that I had bought and hadn't fully finished reading, the answer was there, which is a book by Steve McKnight. And I recommend anyone who reads it. There is a small snippet in there where he kind of explains, if you do it this way, you'll be set for life, sort of thing. Had I read that, but even then I probably wouldn't quite have understood it. So it took me a while to kind of understand the structure and kind of go, okay, well, you know what? Yes, we can still borrow it under a company, but if we pair that with maybe a trust or something like that, then there are certain benefits. There's also a lot of disadvantages that you have to weigh up. And so it got to a point where I decided to restructure it. So I said to my brother, I'll buy you out, but instead of me paying him cash for his share of the property, I gave him my other property that I had because it was the same in terms of the value of his share.
Okay.
So we did that. We restructured it. He also brought in a structure as well. And because he was also having serviceability issues as well, where, he was looking to buy his own place, his principal place, and the banks were like, nope, this is all you have. And he again was like, well, what's going on here? So we restructured everything, and then that allowed me to go off and buy more property, essentially.
So if you come up, is it a hybrid structure that has a sort of corporate trustee and then trusts, or are you able to just break that down for us? And one of the other questions I'd like to ask around that, I guess, is I'm making an assumption here that by using the corporate structure, you could effectively use LODOC type loans where the evidence of income wasn't so reliant. Am I making the right assumption here or not?
You can. I've never done LODOC, to be honest.
Okay.
And probably if I did LODOC, I could probably borrow close to twice as much.
Yep.
I've never been in a position where I needed to do LODOC.
Okay.
And the reason for that is with LODOC, as great as it is, where, banks just take whatever your accountant says to be your income, you're limited to basically second and third tier lenders. You're limited to higher interest rates. And that also affects your credit score to some extent. So I've generally steered clear with that. So for instance, all my properties are with a major full bank in terms of the lending. But what happened with the corporate structure is the way the banks calculate risk.
Yep.
Right. So because it is a business entity, they treat you like a business. You're guarantoring the loan rather than using your own serviceability. And that is the main difference. I know it sounds strange. You're like, there's no difference to buying property in your own name, essentially. But because it's under a different entity, they treat you very, very differently.
How do they, because I know most of the major banks in particular look at the last 2 years' financials for a company to decide what your gross declared taxable income is that they'll then use for the loan servicing. How did you manoeuvre around that exercise?
So in the case of residential mortgages, they don't actually care too much about the business financials because you are personally guarantoring the loan. If I wasn't personally guarantoring the loan, then yes, they will just look at the financials of the business for the last 2 years. But generally speaking, for residential mortgages, they will expect the director to be a personal guarantor on the loan. Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. And you managed to do that through one of the big four, yeah? Yes.
Yeah. Good. Now that's awesome. Okay. So talk to us about the progression of your portfolio from there then, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Yeah. So from there, it was just, being able to buy more property, kind of rinse and repeat with the strategy of the structures. And you suddenly didn't have to worry about serviceability issues because, with that serviceability bucket, once you filled it up, you either have to earn more money or pay down debt to do it. In this case, provided that your entities and the income generated from the properties are actually positive cash flow and there's a surplus in those entities, the banks will not factor in the liability attached to those entities when you go and borrow for a new entity.
Yeah, so you set up a separate structure for each individual property, essentially. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, it's costly.
But in terms of, it might be a cost, but in terms of the value that you're able to secure and then the asset base that you're able to establish, makes a lot of sense. And I think that the key thing that's probably worth reinforcing there is that the property must be positive cash flow after all costs involved in both purchase and
so it's not just
property.
Not just the cost of the loan, it is the cost of the loan, the rates, the management fees, repairs, everything. So it's and that's the other thing, you don't really want to negatively gear in these structures because you can't offset that loss against your personal income tax anyways. So there's things like that. And I guess for me to set up a structure is relatively cheap because being a solicitor, I can do that myself. The other thing you do have to be aware of is the land tax implications that certain structures have. Like for instance, in New South Wales, if you buy in a discretionary trust, you will be paying land tax. Likewise, if you buy in a company, once you hit that threshold of any related entities, then, that's it. There are ways, and I've done it for clients myself, where we can set up structures in a way to create entities that are non-related, but again, they're very, very complex, and they're several thousands of dollars plus. Then you've got to factor in the accounting fees and then the auditing fees as well, because being entities, they need to be audited, obviously.
Yeah, of course, of course. What I'd love for you to give us a bit of a feel for is what was your initial investment strategy when you started, and how has this evolved over time, and why?
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been more focused on cash flow properties with some growth. As we know, historically, all properties will always go up in value. And whilst, I see a lot of people, particularly in the Sydney area, they'll buy these properties, they heavily negative gear them, and then try and sell them a couple of years later to gain on the capital growth so they can have cash to go again. What I've realized is that realistically, as long as your property goes up 50,000 every year, you don't really need a massive cash flow, massive capital gains property. Because every time you sell, you're paying capital gains tax. You want enough equity to be able to have a deposit or two, to then go again. And even with that, like some of the properties I've recently bought, they're on huge lands where I can actually put a granny flat at the back, or I can knock down, build a duplex or a set of, 3 townhouses.
Yeah.
Which not only increases the capital gains of the property, but also increases the cash flow. So initially when I first started buying, it was all about cash flow, being able to have a property that pays off itself. Because I said to myself, I'm not going to invest in a property if I have to put money to it, because I think that's stupid. I hate negative gearing. I don't understand why people would do it. Yes, I understand you get these great capital gains, but when you're paying 50% of it on CGT at the end of the day, you can get the same kind of returns anyways with positive cash flow properties, particularly if you buy, some good ones and have 10 of them, you probably make 100K every year plus the capital growth, which for me is a great investment strategy, much better than shares.
So let's expand on that then. What is your, if we look at your ultimate life vision and your ideal lifestyle, what is your current investment strategy in terms of what it looks like, with the sort of numbers that is going to do to produce the sort of cash flow that you need to sustain your lifestyle?
Yeah, so I mean, my goal at the moment is to get to 10 properties. I'm not quite there yet, but I hope to be within the next 2 to 3 years.
And so how many have you got at the moment?
I have 3.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so within the next 2 to 3 years, I hope to get to 10. So the biggest hurdle for me isn't deposits. It isn't finding the right properties. It's always to do with just meeting the requirements of the banks, and they change according to interest rates, as you know. So that for me has always been the biggest hurdle, particularly now that, I'm in, close to, well, I'm in that sort of higher tax bracket as well. I still get very confounded by banks where they're like, oh, no, you can't borrow this much. And you're like, well, I earn more than you, and you can go out and buy, $1.5 million properties, but you won't give me the same amount of money. Anyways, but it's funny that you have those sort of conversations and thought process. But for me, this strategy is always positive cash flow properties.
Yeah.
With capital growth, obviously, and the potential to develop on them as well.
So I guess the challenge is the level of cash flow that you're getting from them. They'll certainly cover the properties. It's probably not going to be enough to live off. Is there a thought process around the transition at some point in the future where you'll do a partial sell down to eliminate debt and then free up equity that you can then put into more cash-effective cash flows?
I think the only time I probably consider selling is if I want to buy a principal place for myself.
Yeah.
But even then, I would probably just pull out the equity instead. Because even with the 3 properties that I have, I think from memory, each of them make between 5 to 10K profit at the moment. So
10 properties at $5,000 is 50 grand. That's probably not going to be enough to sustain your lifestyle. Do you think you'll need to transition?
So 5 properties will be 50,000. So 10 properties is 100K.
Yeah.
So even that may not be enough, but at least if I have 100K in passive income by the time I'm 40, it means I can choose to work at that point.
Yes.
And I don't have to work as hard necessarily.
Yeah.
And I guess, when is enough property is enough? To be honest, I don't know. I say 100K now, And, 2 years from now will be, $250,000, so.
Well, you've asked a very good question. How much is enough for you? Because if you're clear on exactly how you want to live and how much that lifestyle costs, all you need to do is invest to the point where you're going to generate that passive income and the job's done. So you're well and truly on track as far as that goes. A quick segue, if you like, if you look back so far on your journey, what has been your best and worst investment then, Monica?
I can't say I've had a bad investment so far. I've been very fortunate with my investments in the sense that they've generated very good return and capital growth.
Yeah.
I think I've done a few things. So with the first property that I bought, we did some renovations on that one to increase the rent and also the and get some instant sort of capital growth on the property. So that was quite useful. One of the properties I bought sight unseen sort of thing. So that was a nerve-wracking experience as well. But I did have some inspiration from a mate who's bought like 50 properties sight unseen. So over his lifetime. So I was like, oh, okay. It's, at the end of the day, it's a business, not for a place for me to live in. So, I've been fortunate that my properties have done well. I think some of the things that I have learnt from my property journey has been to really calculate interest rates. So when I run the numbers on a property, I don't run them at what the interest rate is now. So for instance, if I'm about to buy a property, I'm calculating at the interest rate of between 9 to 10%.
Yeah.
And if I can break even at 10%, then I'll buy the property.
Yeah.
Because I know if interest rates, not that they will go up that high, but in the event that they get close to that, I know I can at least pay off the mortgage at the worst case.
Yeah. I love that. If you were starting out again, then would you invest any differently?
If I was starting out again, I would probably start by purchasing in the structures right away rather than taking them out of your personal name and restructuring later, because unfortunately we can't escape stamp duty. And to pay that twice on several properties is not a pleasant experience. And not to mention the capital growth that sometimes can't be avoided. So it is a costly exercise, but then with that said, it has freed up my serviceability to be able to just kind of buy a property as soon as I have a deposit. So that would be my best advice is get the structure right from the beginning. Don't listen to accountants and other people saying, oh, it's okay, you can buy 3 or 4 in your name, then worry about structure, because at that point you have 2 options: earn more money or pay down most of the debt, or third option, sell the properties or sell them into entities. And it's a costly exercise.
Very costly. So if you were starting out again, sort of break down for us how you would structure your portfolio, because this is really good learnings for those that are listening in. Can you sort of take us through that for us?
Yeah, so I would actually get the advice in terms of, what entity structure is suitable to you. So this is also very state dependent because you've got to factor in things like land tax laws, which vary from state to state. So for instance, New South Wales and Victoria, we like to tax the beneficiaries in those states, whereas all other states in Australia, they tax the trustee. So that's if you're thinking about the trust structure. Likewise, companies have different thresholds as well from state to state. So that's something to factor in.
Yep.
The other things then to think about as well, if you're choosing between companies and or company trusts, is whether or not you're going to sit and hold or whether or not you're going to actually then sell. And one thing to calculate, particularly like in the states of New South Wales and Victoria, is, okay, if I were to pay land tax every year versus me putting it in a company, getting the threshold, and then selling, say, 10 years later, would the amount be the same, more or less? And depending on the property, you might actually find you're better off maybe just with a company-only structure than to set it up in a trust. So those are the things you have to weigh out. And the other thing is to work out, how many properties you would like to get to.
Yeah. So
when I first started out, I was happy with 1 or 2, and just to be able to have a little bit of extra income to be able to pay my rent.
Yeah.
Whereas now I'm like, nope, I want to be able to have it fully pay off a mortgage, buy a luxury car, be able to travel the world for, 3-6 months at a time, and to not have to worry about working. So my goals have definitely changed. So the target that I want to hit by the time I'm 40 in terms of properties and passive income is probably up there. Whereas when I first started off, it was like, yeah, if I have 1 or 2 properties, I'm happy with that. So
yeah, I love that. And I guess what I'm picking up from what you're saying there is build it out on paper in terms of the numbers before you even start. So you know what the reality is going to be of the various options, so you're making fully informed decisions. And of course, for the average person who doesn't have your corporate taxation and legal background, they obviously need to be talking to an accountant who understands property and getting the right legal input to assist them with that. Would that be a fair assumption?
yeah, absolutely. So you sort of need to have both the accountant and the lawyer, because the accountant will be able to advise you on like the tax implications. The lawyer can advise you in terms of the legal implications of the structures. So I guess the other advantage as to the way I've set up the properties as well is not only do you have, the ability to potentially, keep going and buy more properties, but you also have things like asset protection. You have tax minimization strategies that you can then implement. Not that it will make much of a difference from this financial year when they redo the tax brackets, but it is, something to then consider, particularly if you do want to have a large portfolio and if you have families and things like that. The last thing you want to have is just everything in your personal name and a will, whereas, some of these more complex structures can be better and more tax effective at the end of the day should you have to pass those properties on to your family. So
100%. Yeah, trust structures are very beneficial in that regard, and having a testamentary trust as part of the estate planning exercise would also be something that would be very well worth considering for most people.
Correct, yeah.
So something a slight parallel with this. So I know that from Google stalking you, Monica, that you're a rentvestor. Talk to us about your decision to be a rentvestor and why you're doing that, and what are the benefits, and also how long do you intend to remain a rentvestor?
I've had a love-hate relationship with renting, particularly with my parents renting, and just knowing how not so much landlords, but more property managers can sometimes be quite
draconian.
And draconian and somewhat greedy sometimes. For instance, they will remove a tenant from the property simply because they get a week's free rent when a new tenant comes in. And if they have a portfolio of 40 properties and the average rent is like, $500 a week, then for them, that's really good money if they can do that every 6 months. They end up with, 20, 30,000 extra in the pocket by the end of the year. And I do feel the pain of renters out there when they're like, we hate moving every so often. The cost of moving is quite expensive, particularly when you have a large family. And a lot of stuff. So number one, get rid of all the stuff. But with that said, I personally, especially now with the value of property, I don't see much point in owning your own home where you have to pay off the mortgage.
Yep.
Right? I'd rather have investments that can pay off my mortgage for me.
Yep.
Because if I lose my job tomorrow, I know at least my rent will cover my mortgage.
Yep.
Right? And I can imagine, particularly once a lot of homeowners and young homeowners who bought properties that were overvalued and overextended themselves when the interest rates were 1.5%, when they come off their fixed term, mortgages August this year, they're going to really struggle to pay that off if they don't have some other secondary source of income. And so that's been one of my key things, is that I would, not pay off a mortgage from my own pocket, at least not entirely from my own pocket. I don't see the point.
And if you've structured the properties like you have, then between the tenant and the tax office, they are covering 100% of the cost of that property. Right. So it makes absolute sense. How much longer do you intend to be a rent vestor? I ask this because I rent vested for many years myself. But this is years ago, before rent vesting was even a thing. We just worked out that was the best thing to be doing, because for the reasons you've just mentioned, we're getting the tenant and the tax office to actually cover all of the costs of the property, and then we could live a lot more cheaply with a lower rent than a mortgage in the areas that we wanted to, which were closer to what we're doing at the time.
Yeah,
So
and it gives you that opportunity to save and reinvest, or even that I'm in a situation where my properties can probably cover my share of the rent. So,
yeah,
so I'm not, fussed with that.
yeah,
That aspect of it. As to how long, I guess it really comes down to, how much do I want to spend on my
yeah,
first PPOR, and
yeah,
am I going to splurge, or am I just going to be modest and,
yeah.
settle for something that I know is not going to be my forever home, but it's going to be the next step towards getting that. Yeah,
Will the investment portfolio end up funding your own home purchase at some point? Is that part of the plan, or is
that's
that
part of
sort
the
of separate
plan.
to it?
So
Yeah,
pull out the equity. I guess, I mean, I could probably already do that now if I wanted to.
yeah, yeah,
But for me, I just have bigger plans. I want to buy a few more properties. Like I said, I want to get to 10 in the next 2 to 3 years. I
yeah,
also want to be able to do some developments on some of the properties as well. So until that happens, then,
yeah,
I'm happy to rent vest.
yeah,
And the good thing about that as well, it's funny you say that there's a stigma, people don't like renting, but one of the things that I learnt in my career as a violin teacher was I used to teach in the eastern suburbs around Double Bay and
yeah.
Bellevue Hill, and a lot of those people that we think are really uber rich and wealthy, they actually rent their own homes for similar reasons. They have lots of investment properties themselves, but they will be paying, at the time I think it was 1,500 to 2 grand a week in rent
Yep.
in properties that are worth 10 mil,
Yep.
because for them to pay off a 10 mil mortgage was unthinkable. And for them, they wanted the lifestyle.
Absolutely. I think makes perfect sense at both ends of the journey, actually, from that perspective. Monica, I want to do a bit of a tangent exercise now and get you to tell us about your teaching software company, MusicBox, because it sounds very interesting. Share with us your entrepreneurial journey around that and what it means and how that's helping the equation.
Yeah, so it was something that I came up just before COVID to do. So when I was a music teacher, one of the things I struggled with was just having a system that had everything in the place that was cost effective. And one of the things that I also discovered was that music teachers are great at teaching, very passionate at what they do, but they're not very business savvy. And a lot of teachers are like, oh crap, who owes me money? Or when's my next lesson? Oh crap, I have a student like in 5 minutes, I gotta go. And they're very kind of like on the fly type people. So one of the things that helped me, particularly with saving for my first deposit, was actually being very systematized with my music teaching business. And treating it more like a business and structuring like a business. So instead of being a sole trader, run it as a company, that sort of thing. So this app is aimed to help particularly the younger generations. It can be used by anyone of all age, but particularly those who are starting out in the music industry or the music education industry more specifically, to have a system in place where they can kind of just go set and forget, and it costs them $1 a day to run.
Yeah.
So one lesson in 1 week will pay for the whole month, sort of thing. So so developing that cost effectively, and for me it was another way to generate passive income. And something I've always wanted to do was get into the tech space, and then if this goes well, then I might launch other apps in other industries like sports and tutoring and stuff like that.
Love it. So it's a monthly membership exercise. So you're actually building a passive income through the user interface. Is that how it works?
That's right.
Love it.
But and there's features on there as well for parents, like for instance, particularly with the online learning space after COVID, teachers will be working with children verified. So you'll see that when you click on their profile that they have a working with children's check or not. So if they don't, you just ask, can you provide us with that evidence? If it says it is, that's one less hassle for a parent. And the other thing that I aim to do through that app as well down the track is to encourage the accessibility of music, particularly in places like regional Australia, but also where there might be lower socioeconomic backgrounds and things like that down the track, depending on how profitable the business becomes. I definitely want to be able to give back to the community, which might mean partnering with a local music shop to, give away, X amount of violins or subsidize a certain amount of lessons or something, to be able to provide the music to everyone, no matter what economic background you're from.
Love it. Absolutely love it. That's a great way to bring us into what I like to call the ambush round, Monica, which is where I give you a blindfold and a cigarette and I ask you the fastball questions that you get on all podcasts. So to kick that off, what's your favourite quote and why?
My favourite quote, I have a few, but I think I can't remember who said it, but my favourite quote really is that education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And I like that because it doesn't matter what you do in life, whether it's investing in property, whether you want to become a doctor, whether you want to become an art teacher, whether you want to become a manager in an accounting firm. If you want to be good at something, you have to educate yourself. And knowledge is power at the end of the day. And that's something that for me throughout my career, and it's part of the reason why I became a lawyer and got into the area of law, was I just wanted to know more about how the law plays for my own personal use, particularly in the property space. And then that became like a lightning bolt moment of, actually, you know what, this could have so many other advantages, as we talked about before. So yeah, education is very, very important.
Love that. Sort of returning to the literary field for me, you mentioned Steve McKnight earlier, and I'm a massive fan of Steve's, and he's actually been on the show a couple of times in recent times. What's the top book that you'd recommend we read and why?
I have actually two. So one of them is the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Stephen Covey, yep.
Yep, Stephen Covey. That for me, I read that back in 2012 when I was sort of in between career changing, and that really changed the perspective in terms of how I deal with people and how I perceive the world, and also, you know, my relationship with money as well.
Yep.
And then of course Atomic Habits. I think that's for anything that you do, and I'll say this both as a property investor and also as a music teacher, whether you're trying to save for a deposit or save for your, you know, your stamp duty in your next property or whatever it is, or, you know, or you're trying to get kids to do their homework, those habits you build and that discipline behind the habits are probably the thing that will set you apart. It's not intelligence, it's not, you know, giftedness or being talented at something. At the end of the day, it's the habits you form that will get you ahead of and help you achieve those goals.
Perfectly said. I'm going to change up the order here, given what you've just said. What's a personal happy habit that's contributed most to your success to date then?
I must admit I'm terrible at habit forming, but I think for me it's more of when I want something, I will do everything possible to get to that particular point. So for instance, like at the moment I'm doing a PhD. Even if I have a very busy day, I will spend at least half an hour on actually reading something that will contribute, or thinking about something that contributes to that PhD, and just making sure it's consistent. So one of the most important things I say, even to my own students that I teach violin to, is that it's not about how much practice you do, it's about the quality and the frequency. So if you do it every day, you will see results pretty quickly.
Absolutely. Yeah, consistency is a big key that a lot of people miss. They're looking for the quick fix and the instant result, but consistency over a long period of time gets that exponential compounding growth working in, whether it's skill, money, wealth, you name it. So nailed that. Just to close off the fast ball, what's the worst and the best piece of investment advice that you've ever received then, Monica?
Okay. The worst piece of investment advice that I got probably was the one where, wait until you have a few more properties before you restructure. And my accountant will kill me because he actually initially said that to me, and then recently he said, out of all my clients that I've known over the past, decade, I never thought you'd be the one that would be the serial investor. And I was like, yes. And I said, imagine if you had told me to structure it properly from the very beginning, and we sort of have a bit of a chuckle there. But like, and that's the thing. And, and I teach accounting students in one of the roles that I do. Funnily enough, from an accounting point of view, you kind of don't give the advice to a client until they need it. So for instance, if it's a mum and dad investor, you'll just say, yep, you can afford it in your personal name. Yeah. Why set it up in a structure? You have all these extra expenses. you're better off. You can negative gear, all this other stuff, which from an accounting point of view is great. But from a wealth management point of view, it's not the best advice. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's horses for courses when it comes to that, and the transition of the entity structure too is really important in terms of the whole exercise. But we might talk about that at a future point. Just to bring everything to a head, then to sort of summarise our great conversation today, then Monica, what are your key takeaways and actions that aspiring investors need to take? Do you think?
I think number one, get the structure right. That's most fundamental. Number two, treat property like a business and take the emotion out. I often see many clients that, are so emotional to try and get that property that they over offer. They don't care if there's massive faults with the property, which could be costly down the track. Take that emotion out, because whilst there might be one property that you miss, there's going to be another 10 exactly the same type of properties somewhere in the country, Yeah. And my third bit of advice is that if you are quite new to investing, and it's funny because you speak to different investors, and I have a mate who just kind of bought most of Broken Hill just for the sake of doing it. And you're like, Broken Hill's not really the best place to invest, but he's doing really, really well. And a lot of investors, are just very lucky investors. But one thing that could help you, I guess, capitalize on things like capital growth and yield and cash flow is to actually ask for help, find like an investment strategist or investment coach or someone who's done it and actually learn from them. And, some of these people, like I'm sort of against using buyer's agents to some extent, because there's a lot of crappy ones out there, and a lot of ones where you can become a buyer's agent overnight, essentially. But with that said, there are one or two out there that are quite good and have large portfolios themselves, that I know of, and they actually know how to look and buy property because they're doing it for themselves. So, and I have mates who do that. So I would say chat to them about that. Yeah. And actually learn from them and invest in those people, because at the end of the day, you might spend, $15,000 on someone to assist you with that property purchase. But if they can save you $50,000 on negotiations and you get a really good deal that within 6 months you've made $20,000-$30,000 on equity, it's definitely worth it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you make a very good point. You need, in any profession, and in particularly in property where it is an elite team sport, you need to be getting the best of the best in each of the professions. And the underlying exercise from what you've just said there as well, which is important to reinforce, is that only talk to property professionals who actually invest themselves and do what they're suggesting you do. It's really key, because if people aren't walking their own talk, they don't understand the nuances that's involved, and you're not likely to get the best result. So some really good thoughts there. Thanks, Monica. Now, I really want to thank you for coming on board today and being so open and sharing your story. We'll follow your story and get you back on in times to come as your portfolio progresses, so that you can continue to share those exercises. But for those in the audience that have really resonated with your message, how can we find out more or get more involved with you, Monica?
Yeah, you can reach out to me. I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Monica Revelis, is my social media handle. So that's probably the best way to reach out to me. Just send me a message on there, and then I can shoot you across my email and organize ways in which I can sort of help you get on board. So I'm always happy to provide advice. I try not to provide financial advice, of course. I can only provide legal advice. But if you want my help, then by all means, feel free to reach me through those platforms.
Fantastic. Look, really enjoyed the chat, and I think it's the start of many to come. Really keen to keep the conversation going, Monica, and thanks for joining us on the show today.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Monica. Thanks for tuning in to Get Invested on the Property Hub podcast channel, your home for property investment insights and inspiration. And don't leave yet until you've taken the next step towards living by design, by getting my award-winning book, Get Invested, absolutely free when you sign up at knowhowproperty.com.au or bushymartin.com.au. And finally, make sure you subscribe to Property Hub to get your weekly dose of Get Invested inspiration along with every episode of Realty Talk, Australia's leading property show for red-hot property investing news and insights, direct from industry leaders and influencers. Remember to always get invested in your knowledge, and I look forward to seeing you next time.